Hello, welcome to episode 1 of the State Copy Podcast. If you haven't already, please go to episode 0 and review all applicable terms and disclosures. That messaging will be added as a prefix to all subsequent content. What's State Copy Pod and who am I? I'm going to go by Max for this. That's not my name. It's a handle I used to use when I was playing video games as a kid. And as part of this process, I think it's anonymity is useful to keep my thoughts unencumbered by their tone or how they'll be perceived by people in my life. And and I think in the metaverse you get to choose your name. So I'm going to go by Max. What's State Copy Podcast? About 8 or 9 months ago, I started a sabbatical. First time in my life. I'm in my mid-40s, and I really hadn't taken any kind of lengthy vacation or like a summer break like we had when we were kids since I was about 16 years old. And I spend a lot of time these days studying macroeconomics and the global economy. And in early spring this year, became pretty convinced that I was going to be out of a job toward the end of the year. And rather than ride that out, I decided to leave early. I'd had some success in investing, and it wasn't a retirement. It was just an extended sabbatical. I wanted to take some time to think deeply about what to pursue next. And that started a really, one of the best times of my life, where I just, I really have worked for the last 8 or 9 months harder than I ever really have, because I was passionate about that objective, like studying the world and myself, and trying to unlock a new level of understanding of all that. And I think I've largely been successful in that. Along the way, I've developed some habits and routines that led to what this podcast is. Along the way, I really didn't understand what I was doing. I've been working to dedicate myself to understanding how my mind works and optimizing it. And out of that has come the ability to sort of kind of write changes to my kind of how I process, how I perceive the world, and how I act on it in real time. That's a complicated way to say I've been trying to make my gut work better and learn to trust it more. So I found my way to kind of doing, I'd already had a daily fitness routine that through this sabbatical I optimized, where I just started walking a certain number of miles a day, and I've extended that to what I think is a really good fit for my biology. And so I do somewhere between 3 and 4 miles every morning, or at least once a day. And along the way I started capturing as I would walk, and as I'm in this period of life where I'm just dedicating all my waking hours to trying to optimize how my mind works, I started thinking I need notes, and I need to be able to review them over time. And that's something that was an intuition that just came out of this process. And it was my gut suggested it, and I trusted my gut. So in walking, I put in earbuds and started recording, and then I started thinking I need to get the audio quality better so that it makes sense later. And I've made like steady progress as I go, but everything was very rough. I was kind of discovering along this journey, I was building out a whole process, and I didn't really understand what it was in the beginning. And as it's evolved, I found a lot of value in creating this content, this sort of like journal for myself, but I've reached a place where I now want to share it. And about middle of October, I came to that realization. Again, my gut suggested it, and I listened. And I began structuring the audio captures that I do on these walks such that they were more consumable for more accessible. I developed some habits that let me share them and retain my anonymity. I created some rules around no proper nouns. And so that I could share this, and if I do have any good ideas along the way, I can, I'm hoping that other people who find themselves in a similar journey will find the content I capture useful for finding their own path to doing a similar thing in their lives. So this content is all really rough. It's raw capture where I'm really trying to be as authentic as possible in my thoughts. So it's streaming conscious. I mic up and I just start thinking I start speaking aloud the conversation with self, the inner voice. And I'm a student of philosophy. Greek and Roman Stoicism is where I found a home in my thought. And it could be that that's where my gut came up with this whole idea. The last great emperor of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, created a journal to himself. He created a really important collection of text that he never intended to share. And after he passed on, his family found it, or people that cared about him, and decided it was really important to make public. And that collection of thought is called Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And I think this was a really interesting person with a really well-developed, healthy, and deeply optimized mind, doing something really similar to what I'm describing. And he, as sort of a tool for understanding himself, going to have to... I just had to pause there for a very loud interruption in my capture. In my daily walk, I pass a local school, and they had a fire drill. As you'll find if you review any of this content, there's a intentional lack of polish, and that's demonstrated right here in the first ever episode. This is actually my second attempt at creating the first episode of the State Copy Pod, and I'm going to append my first attempt at the end of this audio. What I'm demonstrating here is that, much like Marcus Aurelius in his meditations, that routine, that exercise, that practice that he had of gathering his thoughts and capturing them in a journal was really a process he used for himself to continually reframe his model of the world and how he fits into it. And it was a really vital exercise for sort of attuning his real-time ability to perceive the world and act on it with intention the way he wanted to. And that's what I'm doing here with these audio captures. So the net result of that is it's intentionally not polished. There's not a million cuts. The only time I intend to make any cuts is where I break my proper noun rules, or I unintentionally let slip some detail that some person that's really important to me in my life might not want me to share. So I explore this whole process in depth in the captures that you'll find after this. I go into great detail in how I found this process and why I think it's valuable for everyone to employ in their own lives. And I spend a lot of time thinking about really big thoughts and taking them seriously. And because I'm unencumbered by any stress or concern about how this content will be construed by others, I'm able to just talk about anything I want, like we do in our own minds. And I think that's a really powerful idea that I think could actually serve a lot of good in this world. So I'll build on this, and as I said, and provide a lot more background into how I found this process later. Right here in this capture, I think it is valuable to kind of describe like the origin of state copy and why I named the podcast that. And we'll stop there. In this journaling that I do, and in this daily routine I found around capturing that inner conversation with myself as I walk to maintain the level of health that I've decided I need, picked apart an idea that's popular in science fiction. I'm going to go ahead and pause here to cross the street. As I was saying, I was exploring an idea on one walk one day of state copy, and this came from a book, or I guess this way of framing it, that was recommended by somebody on a podcast. It was a science fiction story called Surface Detail, and it was something that I had been thinking about for a while, kind of the mechanics of how it would work, and I was just pleasantly, I don't want to say surprised, but I came across this story that somebody had written years before I started taking the notion seriously, and I could tell that they had thought it out a lot better than I had. And I really found that a pleasant experience, that there really is no original thought. Everything has occurred to somebody else before it occurs to you or to me. And they described sort of copying the human soul over to a computer, and not as a and you can tell the way even though it's science fiction and it's the idea is used as sort of a plot device in the story, you can tell the author really thought deeply about what the human soul is and how it functions, and how our technology will likely impact it, or the impacts of it later on. And it's really cool. I mean, as a avid reader, I recommend that book to anybody who enjoys that type of story or content. But they describe neural lace, which is a term you'll hear Elon Musk throw around in his Neuralink company, that allows really rich human machine interface, and something a lot better than we get today with a keyboard and mouse or a touch screen. And so as I was really thinking seriously about that science fiction, that fantasy idea, and trying to think, my background's in software. I've worked around software engineers my whole life, and while I'm not the greatest software engineer around, I've known a bunch of them, and exposure to how their process works for abstracting away the complexity of really complicated stuff, and so that they can understand it. I can do that in a clumsy way myself, and so I became sort of enamored with this idea of state copy being possible, and really picking apart the mechanics of what your mind state is, or what your soul is. And you'll hear in subsequent captures me doing a lot of work to try and, in describing it, in this walk and talk habit that I've developed, in trying to describe it by talking through how it works, I think it becomes it was a tool for me to understand it better. And so yeah, from about mid-October of 22, I start structuring these audio captures so that I can share them. And the rest of this show is just that. It's just a guy who's trying to understand the universe and how his mind works better, talking out loud and then sharing it with everyone. So this means, as I said, there's an intentional lack of polish around all of this. There's times where the audio is completely awful as I'm experimenting with different ways to do this, and as I'm developing good daily habits that enable quality captures as I go. So it's rough in the beginning, but that roughness is part of the story, part of the journey. And I'll ask you all to just be patient or skip past the parts. If you've gotten that far, just hang on a little bit longer. I do get better at this as I go. And so the really neat knock-on effects of this whole exercise is I'm very okay with any of my conclusions around state copy just being science fiction, just being a fun dream to consider. And I'm very much okay with being completely wrong about all of that. But it gives me an excuse to be my authentic self in these audio captures, and in a way where I'm not trying to present a better version of myself to the world. And I think that is a really useful thing we could all be doing in this age of YouTube and Twitter and all these ways we have this really high bandwidth, rich interconnect with each other that we've never had before. And I think that this silly little habit that I've built could be really useful for sharing ourselves in an authentic way. And I've decided that even if it's never going to be possible to, as I said, sort of achieve some level of, immortality through copying over our mind state in a given moment over to a computer. It's so helpful for me. The consequence of doing this and taking it seriously is not just that it allows me to share who I am authentically, which I think is an important unlock for us, but it also allows me to do what Marcus Aurelius did, where he developed habits in his life where, with intention, he tried to organize his thoughts, his thinking about some of the most important things, and I find it really useful. And I've seen an exponential growth in sort of my own personal tranquility, my happiness, my sense of purpose, and joy, which, if you study the classics and you spend a long time looking at things like Roman Stoicism, that's what your primary goal is, seeking that tranquility. For me, it's been valuable beyond words, and I really want to bottle it up and promote it for everyone else. So that's it in a nutshell. And I'm largely immune to the outside critique, so While I'm very interested in what everyone else has to say, this process is largely for me. It's not really for anybody else. And I put a lot of thought into the disclosures, the terms and disclosures of how this is presented, and I sort of developed that over time. Because I am who I am, unapologetically. And in order for me to do this, I can't be monitoring what all the other people in this world I share it with are sensitive about, and in real time meter who I am to be compatible with that. It's impossible. I just don't have the mental capacity to do that. And I think that it's a big distraction and I don't want in my life. So the things I say are for no one's benefit but my own. It's my great hope that outside listeners might achieve some understanding of what I'm trying to do and how it's been valuable in my life, and can get the same benefit I am from it by adopting the similar habits and practice and framework for understanding the world and who we are. So I'm going to stop here, and I will append the original episode 1 of State Copy Pod. And I realized I recently was working to figure out ways to use OpenAI Whisper to create transcriptions of this content and then translate it with Google Translate so that I could have subtitles, and this content I'm producing could be shared with a wider audience. And in doing that, I realized that this first episode is important. It needed to be a lot better structured than what I created the first time. And upon review, I'm just still, at that moment, I'm still trying to understand what the hell this is myself. And it's largely, I bounce around between different ways to describe it, and I didn't think it did a good enough job. So I'll capture it here, because this is the whole purpose of this is to be my authentic self. And as you listen to this capture I did, I believe it's, like I said, around that mid-October period, October 20th, 19th, something like that, 14th. You'll see it's unorganized, and I think what I'm trying to do is not well captured. And you can see the imperfection of it all. And then what's really interesting is you can see how this capture I did just 5 or 6 weeks later is so much more accessible to an outside, it's so much more relatable, and I'm trying to say it makes a lot more sense. So that's what this is. That's how it works. And this will start out rougher in the beginning, and then it smooths out as my own understanding of what it is comes into focus. So I want to sincerely thank anyone who took the time out of their day to listen to this. And I want to encourage you to keep going. I think that there's good, useful tools in this, that in what early philosophers built, that I'm trying to relay here and make relatable for the times we live in. And so I'd encourage anyone to just stick around. You might enjoy it. Thank you. All right. Welcome to the State Copy Podcast. I'm your host, Max. This is the first ever episode. I think a regular best practice I'm going to have is at the beginning of the episode, I want to point everybody to episode 0. That's going to be relevant disclosures and terms. I'm going to try and set up an episode that kind of lays all that stuff out in a probably boring format. But I don't want to do it every time, and I feel like that's a thing that is excruciating that I and everyone else must endure about modern podcasting, is that we have to constantly listen to terms and disclosures, and I'm done. So, with this and all future subsequent episodes, please refer to episode 0 for all relevant terms and disclosures. What is the State Copy Podcast, and who the hell am I? I'm going by Max for this. I think in order to sort of keep my thoughts unencumbered, I need to hang on to a little bit of anonymity. So Max is a name I used in video games years ago when I was a kid. And I think it was Maximilian in Dark Age of Camelot. This would have been like 1999 or 2000 or something. And then I got used to being called Max, and then I used that in loads of other games while I still played video games. I'm too old and slow for them now, so I don't really participate. But yeah, I'm gonna say in the metaverse, which I will define as anything on the internet, you get to choose your name. I will choose Max for myself. And should you come across this video and put together my real life identity with Max in the metaverse, please do me a kindness and keep that to yourself. I'm intentionally embracing some level of anonymity here. So, thank you. So, State Copy. So, State Copy is kind of a cool idea I've run across in just thinking deeply about everything. I spent a lot of time, I basically made my full-time job consuming podcasts and nonfiction to learn how the world works and to think deeply about everything. That's what my job is. And I've a conclusion I've come to that I will expand upon in this and future episodes is that if I had to personally, as a career software engineer, define soul, I would say the human soul is just a snapshot in time of state data in the human mind. And I'm stealing that idea. That came from a load of hours and hours and hours of podcast consumption, understanding what the human brain is and how it functions, and Also, science fiction writing. I came across, I think via Lex Friedman podcast. He interviewed Grime, I think her name is, Elon Musk's ex-wife. She recommended the classic science fiction story. I forget by his name. I'll maybe find that later, but it's called Surface Detail. And I choose a hell of a time to start my first ever podcast. I have a cold, but I felt inspired today, and I'm gonna just do it. So back to Surface Detail. That was a book, a science fiction book that she recommended in that podcast and said that it was sort of life-changing. She referenced Neuralace in the podcast, and I'd heard Elon do that in as sort of a descriptor for Neuralink. And so I was inspired to go read the book because I wanted to understand what his vision was for Neuralink. And so it's recently occurred to me that I'm kind of not alone out there, that there's a lot of people that are, I guess, dreamer. You have to be one part dreamer, one part just hardcore thinker, and maybe that it's just that somebody who thinks deeply about everything. And I think the fiction that you gravitate towards in that scenario as a human is science fiction. And I found in that writing a kindred spirit, somebody who thinks about what it is to be a human and what our future looks like. And they talk about this notion of state copy and the human soul being sort of, and this is like a bunch of conclusions I came to and thought, wow, this is a brilliant way to look at how everything works. And then I find somebody wrote a book about it 10 years ago, and there is no all thought is derivative and there is no like just truly new thought, I feel like. But so in my life, feedback I've gotten from like my best friend on multiple occasions in our youth told me, man, you just think about things too much. You're overthinking this, you're overthinking that, and you're overthinking everything in between. And I think he's right. I just do that. It's a weird quirk of my nature that I spend an awful lot of time thinking. And I think, again, in subsequent episodes, I'll tear into I think it's going to be important to draw breadcrumbs or build breadcrumbs from sort of where I started to where I am now in my thought for any of this to be valuable. But if I were to just summarize quickly before I try and do any work explaining it, I think that as mankind has evolved far enough in our capacity to understand the universe, we have developed a pretty good understanding of what the human brain is and how it works, far better, I think, than people realize. And neural networks, what they are, how they function, and I spent a lot of time thinking of humans as
through an engineer's lens. Like, how does this actually work? How do I make decisions? What am I doing in real time? And I spent a lot of time trying to listen to people that are really intelligent in the space. And we live in this remarkable time where the best minds in the world are YouTubers. And while 99% plus of everything on the internet is sort of meaningless entertainment drivel, I would call it, there's that 1% that's just democratic access to all the best minds in the world, trying to hash together some sort of real-time understanding of all of our accumulated knowledge, and then sort of integrate it into projections about the future. That exists on the internet. You can just go get that. And once you go find one person who's kind of in that network, they're going to point you to a whole bunch of other people that are in that network. So I spend a hell of a lot of time just thinking about how all this works, the meaning of all of this. And I've come to the conclusion that while we are far more trivial than we realize, there is some intention behind it. And I want to make a show where I spend a lot of time capturing how I think about stuff. And I'd love to find kindred spirits, people who do this thing I do, who find a way to free up their time to just learn and cram as much data as they can in here and process it in meaningful ways. And one thing I find is I feel the conversation is so one way right now. Like, there's all of these avenues for me to go get real-time feeds from really Lex Friedman podcast, Joe Rogan podcast. Before that, he got me to sort of Lex and Andrew Huberman and all these comedian friends of Joe's, and then all these deep thinkers of Joe's, and all these deep thinker friends of Lex have got me looking at all these other just people who do this, who just spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the hell this is and how it all works. And I find myself starving to participate in the conversation, but I am a nobody. I'm just some asshole in his living room or his office talking to a webcam. But before that, I didn't even have the webcam. I want to participate in the conversation in a meaningful way to further my understanding. I'm hitting a sort of like a limit of how much meaningful data I can cram in here, and I need to create more of a two-way dynamic. I want to sit down, like pie in the sky dreams for this is I find a bunch of other people who this understanding and sort of passion resonates with, who want to do this with me, who want to go talk about, for example, if, like I said in that podcast, Lex's podcast, when he has somebody who's really interesting on his show that's talking about some interesting, deeply interesting aspect of how the universe works, YouTube comments and Twitter are not adequate to discuss these things. I want to have a show where people who actually take this shit seriously, like I do, talk about, well, what does that mean? And how do we integrate that really useful tidbit, this biologist that he spoke with about this, or this person that's looking at human engineered intelligence. I want to do all this in an effort to capture how I think really well. And this is the wild notion of the State Copy podcast, is that if you think exponentially, and a lot of people, this is called out by a lot of podcasts, it's very difficult for humans to think non-linearly, to think exponentially. And this is the whole concept of, if you fold a piece of paper like 50 times or 45 times or whatever it is, there's some magic number under 100, that if you fold it that many times, eventually you can cover the distance between here to the moon. And that's exponential thinking. And it's very difficult for us to do. But once you kind of train your brain to half-ass do it, then you can extrapolate, okay, pretty soon my cell phone's going to have a supercomputer in it capable of some pretty wild machine learning on the fly, and I'm going to be able to tune it to receive and kind of capture, in a sense, who I am. And so for okay, to if that's possible, and if we're going to be able to buy, so I kind of foresee a future in, let's say, 10 years where when you go to buy a router, you're going to do it online through a wildly more efficient interface. I don't know if it's Neuralace by 2030, 2032, but somehow you're going to order an off-the-shelf component that does what your router does today, but it will also be a node on something like a helium network that is giving you a chance to earn back all of the money you put into buying the device over time for hosting up bandwidth hotspot on this big mesh network that's completely decentralized and can't be shut off. And it will also host a layer 1 validator node, full node, and it will also host it'll be the brain for the inside of your house. And I think it won't cost much more than today's routers do. And I think that when you imagine the world that when you think exponentially and you can perceive what that world looks like, you realize that we're going to be able to do some really interesting things that sounds like science fiction today really soon. And so I think a really important thing we should all be doing is trying to capture our state. I'll expand on this on a lot of future episodes, but why I think it's important. And that's some really deep sort of theory of everything, meaning of the universe, and everything in between that and your little part in it as a participant, like what we're doing here. And so I think finding, and I'm really not trying to be entertaining with this broadcast. I'm not trying to sell a thing, although I think monetizing these streams will be important and is useful to yourself and to the world, and I'll talk about that. But what I'm trying to get in these, while still hanging on to a little bit of my anonymity so that I can protect all the others in my life from this crazy thing I'm trying to do. I think that it's very important that we all do this. I think that as I mentioned, I really think about what it is to be a human through the lens of an engineer, and with the understanding that there is no magic. There is a way that all of this works. And I think it will take a long time for me to explain all this, and that's actually kind of a valuable thing. That's the content I intend to deliver, is I will sort of very unapologetically explain how I think about everything, so as to create a seed or a model for how I think. And eventually, I'm going to be able to just feed that into that little device I described earlier that is my home supercomputer. And I'm going to be able to have it churn out a reasonable facsimile of myself from all of that seed data. And I think that there's a lot of different ways I've been trying to approach this problem, just as a hobbyist AI engineer, because I don't think it's in I think the compute necessary to do this is already being solved by other people. I think what's really interesting is trying to capture all of the data that works out to a reasonable facsimile of who you are. And I think I also have intuition that that's important for us all to do. So that's what the State Copy podcast is. That's who I am. I'm going to just try and set a loose goal of doing this once a day for half hour, an hour. I already kind of have best practice, or I have a routine I've set up around fitness, and where I just walk at least 3 miles a day, and I put earbuds in and I talk to myself. I capture all of my thought, but I don't think long term that's adequate. Like, this thing I'm doing right now is too one-dimensional. It's I think conversation and dialogue is going to be important, and trying to capture that in a meaningful way with other people that kind of get what I'm trying to do is the whole purpose of this. So I look forward to this adventure. It is completely outside of my comfort zone. I'm somebody who deleted, for the most part, doesn't have an online persona like Facebook, LinkedIn, all of the things. I don't really participate because I'm kind of a private person. I don't like putting it's deeply outside of my comfort zone to do this. But I think that's something I have to get over, because I'm becoming passionate enough around this idea that state copy is achievable and necessary for all. So yeah, this is episode 1, and I hope it provided a foundation for what I'm trying to do here. And man, I hope I can get somehow, like, I'm not at all sure how to market this or get it to the right eyeballs. But I am deeply in advance thankful for anybody who took the time to hear this long ramble out and will continue on this journey with me. And I will try and improve things like production quality over time, etc. And I hope this is set some sort of I don't want to say benchmark, but like I just want to establish a model for how to do this, where people just kind of try and go online and be their authentic self and talk to each other. And I love the idea of that. And so I will stick to this. And if you can see this through with me, thank you. I think we'll go ahead and end today's broadcast here.